Good day and welcome to the Child Welfare Capacity Building Center for States Protective Capacities and Protective Factors, Common Ground for Protecting Children and Strengthening Families infographic conference call. Today's conference is being recorded. Before we begin, I would like to turn the call over to Ms. Meredith Pochilli. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is interactive and includes several polling questions. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, we encourage you to type any questions into the Q&A pod. This webinar is being recorded, and both the recording and infographic will be emailed to all registrants at the end of the month. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please contact Christy Stankovich at the email address listed on the screen, or feel free to send us a message through the Q&A pod. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Quincy Wilkins of the Capacity Building Center for States.
Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm Quincy Wilkins with Capacity Building Center for States. I'm the Program Area Manager for Child Protection in Home and Family Preservation areas. On behalf of the Center, we welcome you to Protective Capacities and Protective Factors, Common Ground for Protecting Children and Strengthening Families infographic webinar. We're happy you have joined us today. And if you were on the call on Thursday or attempted to join us on Thursday, we apologize once again for not being able to complete the webinar at that time. Also, we're very happy to have Children's Bureau Federal Program Officer Sharon McKinley on the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. I'll now turn it over to Kathy Sims to introduce herself and our presenter, Teresa Costello.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I have the great pleasure of introducing our presenter today, Teresa Costello. I know this is a name that's very familiar to many of you. Teresa is currently the Executive Director of Action for Child Protection and was formerly the Director of the National Resource Center for Child Protection. She has 30 years in the field of child welfare and has done extensive work on safety decision-making. She's also integrally involved in the work of Action to conceptualize the caregiver protective capacities concept. So I'm going to turn it over to Teresa now.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Quincy. And I'd like to thank the OCAN, Elaine Stedt. I know that she's not on with us today, but thank you for the opportunity to do this. And to the leadership of the Capacity Building Center for States, looking forward to having a chance to share some ideas with you today. And also thank you to the talented people who took the concepts and the content and turned it into the infographic, which you will get to see in just a couple minutes as we get into the webinar. But I think they did a really nice job of producing a visual way of understanding the relationship between protective capacities and protective factors. So I'm excited to share that with you today. So in terms of our purpose for this webinar, the idea is that we will give you a chance to see the infographic, and we will talk about the concepts of protective capacities and protective factors. Our objective is to show you the highlights and the common ground between these two frameworks. And I think it's important to point out that we don't see these as competing frameworks, but we see them as complementary. And as I go through this, I'll talk about the ways in which they work together in our larger system of child welfare. And at the end of the webinar, we're going to ask you to think about how you see the common ground and see that you might be able to use the infographic in the work that you do. We'll also have a chance to point you towards additional resources, because as a webinar with a limited amount of time, we're not going to go into all the depth that we could on each of these frameworks. So we'll make sure that you're aware of additional resources that are available for you to study the two different frameworks. And as I said, we're going to have a chance for you to think about how you might apply these. So a little bit of context for why we thought this webinar and the infographic in general was necessary. My experience in child welfare is over the years, I've had people asking me questions, whether it's a policy question or a practice question. It's not uncommon to have someone say, in our state we use this a concept of protective factors, And then I've also heard of other jurisdictions using the concept of protective capacities. Are they the same? Are they related? Do they work together? Those kinds of questions. And so when we started thinking about this particular infographic, we wanted to be sure that we were very clear about what are these frameworks and how are they complementary, where do they come from, and how can we think about using them in a complementary fashion across our child welfare system. So we know that there are different frameworks, and we're going to talk about those. We know that practitioners, in terms of safety, making decisions about safety, the primary conceptual framework which is being used is protective capacities. And we know that in the prevention realm, the primary framework that's being used is the protective factors framework, and that's used in the context of strengthening families, working to reduce risk, looking for ways to serve families, looking for ways to measure outcomes with families. So we see these two frameworks as being complementary, as I said, not competing frameworks. And the goal of both of the frameworks really, and our goal of our infographic, is to find and think about the common ground so that our work with families across the child welfare system, across the continuum, can be as effective as possible. So we'd like to start with just to kind of get a sense of what you might be using in your jurisdiction. We have 3 polling questions which we'd like you to answer, please. The first one is, are you currently applying caregiver protective capacities in your work? So if you could take a second to answer that question. Yes, no? Again, the question is, are you currently applying caregiver protective capacities in your work? Okay, so it looks like we've got most people have answered that question. Okay, let's end the poll on that one. Okay, and we have our next question is, are you currently applying the protective factors framework in your work? And the question is, are you currently applying the protective factors framework in your work? All right, and our we had about 85% saying yes on that one. The third question we have is, are you currently applying both the protective capacities and the protective factors frameworks in your work? Okay, so it looked like we had about close to 85% of you were saying you were applying either one, the protective capacities. Same thing for protective factors, and then about 70% applying both. So we have a good number of people on the call that are familiar with either or both of the frameworks, which is excellent. So a little bit about the protective capacities framework, and what you'll see in the middle now is the infographic. And we're going to take a chance. You can see that it's scrolling a little bit. We wanted to give you an opportunity to see it so that as I talk through it, you have a sense of what I'm talking about. And so the infographic begins with the visual of the protective capacities framework. And what you'll notice about that is that it's got the picture of a person, an individual in the middle of that, and then around it, it's got the little bubbles that describe what the protective capacities are. So protective capacities are caregiver characteristics directly related to child safety. And these are characteristics that we know when they're effectively carried out, whether they're behavioral, cognitive, or emotional capacity, they are effective at keeping children safe from harm, protecting them from danger. And in the context of child protection, we think about building protective capacity so that we can reduce risk. So there's a relationship between the reduction of risk and the system's focus on building protective capacity by focusing on those individual attributes of the caregivers. The Protective Capacities Framework was developed by my organization, Action for Child Protection, as part of one component of a comprehensive safety practice model called SAFE, which stands for the Safety Assessment and Family Evaluation. And you can see in the picture that we have around the person in the center, we have the behavioral, cognitive, and emotional protective capacities. And we're gonna talk through what each of those are for just a couple of minutes so we have an understanding of what each of those concepts are. So behavioral protective capacities are those things that are associated with parents acting, parents doing. So when you think about actions or performance that result in protection against danger. And on the slide we have some examples. I'm not going to read all these to you, but this is just to give you an idea of behavioral protective capacity has to do with caregivers taking action, demonstrating impulse control, having physical capacity to protect and care for their children, having energy, being assertive, using resources to meet their child's basic needs. And when we think about the caregiver in the context of child protection, we think of it could be anyone who's in a caregiving role. It doesn't have to be, you know, the biological mother or the biological father. It's whoever is in the role of providing the caregiving for that child. Could be a grandmother, could be a mom, could be boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever it is in that particular role. So in the context of child protection, we're looking at those things that are associated with action and doing to protect children from harm or from danger. That's the behavioral protective capacity. On the next slide, we have a summary of the concept of cognitive protective capacity, and this is just as it sounds. It's about knowledge, understanding, and perception that result in protection against danger. And again, we have some examples. We have thinking about how a caregiver has a plan, can articulate a plan to protect a child, how they're aligned, how they have adequate knowledge to carry out those important tasks associated with caregiving. Reality-oriented, an accurate perception, so understanding a child's capacity, what are appropriate expectations for that child given their level of development. A really important part of cognitive protective capacity is the self-awareness of the caregiver, their own understanding of their limits, their boundaries, those things that might be triggers for them. Then the third area of protective capacity is emotional protective capacity. And this, as it says, is the definition: feelings, attitudes, and identification with the child that result in protection against danger. And we give some examples here: resilience, being tolerant, having a strong bond with the child, caregiver who's able to express love, empathy, sensitivity towards the child, understanding the child's feelings and their perspective. So those three different categories, as you can see pictured on the infographic, are what come together to represent caregiver protective capacities used in the context of assessing for safety in child protection work. So the slide that says how is the caregiver protective capacities framework used, that's exactly how it is. We're creating a method for child protection staff to evaluate and understand the current capacity that a caregiver has behaviorally, emotionally, and cognitively to protect their child from danger. It begins at the point of an investigation in a child protection case, and it's an important assessment when we're looking at trying to understand how to put together a safety plan for a child. If we've determined that a child is unsafe, we want to understand the degree to which protective capacities exist or don't exist in that family as a way of figuring out if it's possible to have an in-home safety plan, if it's going to be necessary to have an out-of-home safety plan. And our work on protective capacities doesn't stop at the point of safety planning. It continues as the case goes on into ongoing services. Then the focus, the protective capacities focus, is then on how do we help to enhance those capacities which are lacking, so that it becomes a case plan focus, looking at how to change those protective capacities to enhance them so that the caregiver will be able to provide for safety on an ongoing basis. So the outcome, we hope, is the successful enhancement of caregiver protective capacities as a result of our work with families through the Child Protective Services process. We enhance protective capacities so that we can have children safely with their caregivers in the long run. So there's different ways that jurisdictions use and have operationalized the protective capacities, and we can give you, offline some additional information about that. Florida, for example, is currently in the process of using a protective capacities framework, and they have scaled the protective capacities as a way of measuring progress in working with them. But the framework itself is the key piece to here. So the most important thing about the protective capacities is thinking about its knowing, feeling, and doing, those things that are very much action-oriented to keep children safe or protected from danger. And again, you can see on the infographic how that's represented. There are additional resources on the Child Welfare Information Gateway. You can find more information about the protective capacities concepts, also on Action for Child Protection website if you're interested in looking at some more of those. So moving on to our protective factors framework. So the protective factors, and you can see they're scrolling up so you can see the visual representation of these factors. But protective factors are conditions or attributes of individuals, families, communities, or the larger society that reduce risk and promote the healthy development and well-being of children and families today and in the future. These factors help ensure that children and youth function well at home, in school, at work, in the community, and not only, as we said today, but into adulthood. Protective factors also serve as a buffer. They help parents who might otherwise be at risk of abusing their children to find resources, to find supports, coping strategies that allow them to be effective as parents, even in stressful situations. There are a number of protective factor approaches that are used by various programs, including one developed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and the Administration on Children and Families. For the purposes of this webinar and the focus of the infographic, which you're looking at, we're using the protective factors framework that the Children's Bureau uses, which was adapted from the Strengthening Families framework, which was developed by the Center for the Study of Social Policy, with the addition of a sixth factor, nurturing and attachment. So looking at what these 6 factors are, and again, you can see the pictures that go along with this. The first one, nurturing and attachment, is the emotional tie along with a pattern of positive interaction between the parent and the child that develops over time. For each of these 6 factors that we've put on here, we've also put a couple of little paragraphs, again, just a small amount of the information that's available, but a little description that tells you about what is the research support for these particular factors, as well, as understanding why they're critical. So you can see, related to the nurturing and attachment, that it references the research that shows that babies who receive affection and nurturing are likely to, develop into adults, children, teens, and adults who are happy, healthy, have good self-regulation, have good problem-solving skills, shows that they're likely to, later in life, have better grades, have healthier behaviors, positive interaction, and be able to cope with stress later in life. And the picture in the infographic related to nurturing attachment, of course, is this nice picture of a parent holding a child. The second protective factor, parental resilience, having adaptive skills and strategies to persevere in times of crisis. It's the family's ability to openly share positive and negative experiences and mobilize to accept, solve, and manage problems. And the descriptors here that we have are associated with parents who can cope with stress, everyday life, those things that come up that they're challenged with, bouncing back, knowing how to seek help in times of trouble, looking at the life's ups and downs, helping children learn critical self-regulation. What you'll notice about these in the descriptors, we're not trying to make a crosswalk per se with the protective capacities and the protective factors, but if you read about these in depth, you'll see that there is an obvious relationship and similarity between some of the concepts in both of the frameworks. So for example, in this one, you can clearly see things that are very similar to the emotional protective capacity that we looked at in the protective capacities framework. but you can also see a relationship to behavioral protective capacity, because this is about doing, it's about mobilizing, solving, managing, those things that would be evident in a parent who has the behavioral protective capacity to keep their children safe. So as I said earlier, this is not about trying to show, that these are competing frameworks, but that they are in fact complementary and have some components that are very similar, as well as some components that are somewhat different because they're used for different purposes. And so on this one, the picture we have for parental resilience, which I love, is it looks like a parent juggling lots of different things, which we know as parents is that's a way what you have to do. Okay, our next factor, social connections. Network of positive friends, family, neighbors, schools, social institutions which provide practical and emotional support. And this is the picture, when I think about this protective factor, I think about the village. This is the village that we know it takes to raise children successfully. We have some examples here. So we have, the network of supportive friends, family, neighbors that are there to help out when we need it. It's from things as simple as, rides, transportation, childcare when necessary, those kinds of things. And very importantly, these are the kinds of factors and influences that help to prevent isolation, which we know is can be a risk factor when families are isolated from those kind of social supports and connections. The next protective factor we have is concrete support in times of need. And here we have the definition, access to tangible goods and services to help families cope with stress, particularly in times of crisis or intensified need. And here in the description, those kind of basic things, food, clothing, housing, and transportation. And we know that when we are successful at meeting those, that if we can meet people's basic needs in terms of survival, that's going to help them to have the energy and the time to be able to devote to child safety and well-being. The picture we have here for this protective factor is the hand with the food, clothing, and shelter pictured in it. The next protective factor, number 5, knowledge of parenting and child development. And this one, our definition, understanding and utilizing effective child management techniques and having age-appropriate expectations for children and use abilities. And again, this is one where you can clearly see a connection, a similarity, a complementary concept to the cognitive protective capacity, where we're talking about understanding a child's level of development and their particular needs. And the description here that again gives support for this protective factor is that if this capacity is present, we know we'll have parents who understand child development and can interact with their children in ways that are respectful, that show effective communication. They'll exhibit consistent rules and expectations. They'll have appropriate limits. They'll do things that promote independence for a child appropriate to their age and capacity. And what we're trying to avoid, the lack of that is that the parent who may not understand those types of things may have more likely to have use harsh or inappropriate discipline. And the picture we have for this one looks like the different stages of child development, a child growing up from a child into an adult. The sixth protective protective factor, social and emotional competence of children. Our definition here, children's age-appropriate ability to regulate their emotions, engage with others, and communicate feelings. And here we have a nice description, children's emerging ability to form bonds, to interact positively, to have self-regulation of their behavior, communicate their feelings, solve problems effectively. And it's really about, understanding the individual's child's needs. And you'll see a note here at the bottom within the ACYF conceptual model. These are referred to as individual level protective factors. there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's a great deal of information. I'll give you a reference to a guide at the end that goes into much more detail about each of these different levels if you're interested in looking more at those. And here our picture for this particular protective factor is the picture of the children playing. So then if you go down to, oh, sorry, we have another one. We have 2 slides for this one, social and emotional competence of children. We also have a description here about the, again, the outcome, the result of children having social and emotional competence is that the parents, the caregivers, are more responsive to the children's needs, less likely to be frustrated and stressed, as their children learn to communicate effectively, be able to tell them how they're feeling, communicate, what they need. So the result of social and emotional competence is described on that next slide. So those are the 6 factors, and now if we scroll to the bottom of the infographic, you'll see here's the part of the picture that we want to put together, which is the common ground. And as we think about, first of all, how the protective factors framework is used, that helps us to understand what the common ground is. So the protective factors framework has been used extensively in programs focused on child abuse and prevention. I know we have a number of folks on the calls that are associated with CBCAP programs. We're also seeing that framework used increasingly in other child welfare contexts, such as foster parent training, child welfare training programs, in practice models, in assessment tools, differential response strategies, and early childhood systems. In all these applications, the Protective Factors Framework focuses on prevention strategies based on building strengths with families rather than focusing exclusively on risks and deficits. We know that protective factors serve as a buffer against adversity, and when present in families, the likelihood of child maltreatment goes down. Protective factors are at the heart of a family-centered, strength-based approach, which moves practice from risk mitigation to well-being promotion. So the common ground, which we have pictured here now, we have the caregiver, the individual, in the center of the picture, and around it we have the 6 protective factors pictured. Both frameworks are strength-based approaches to assess, intervene, and serve families. Both frameworks work together, and they provide concrete concepts and tools that child welfare staff can use to help identify, assess, and serve families across the child welfare continuum. By promoting both protective capacities, which are the individual level protective capacities, and protective factors, which include individual, family, and community levels, we can ensure child safety and promote child and family well-being. A really important thing to think about is those of you who are on the call or maybe listening, when you're thinking about policy and program development, if you understand how both of these frameworks can be complementary as opposed to competing, that can help in guiding the development of policy and guiding the development of programs and thinking about how to use these, again, as we said, across the child welfare continuum. So our picture at the end that's got the common ground has just a summary paragraph that says both the things that I've said, strength-based, can help us to promote individual level factors as well as family community level factors. So this infographic, as I said at the beginning, will be available to you for your use, and we're interested in hearing how you might think about using it. I also wanted to make sure that there's a couple of resources. We're going to ask you a couple questions here in a second, but I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware. There's a great document called Building Community, Building Hope, the 2016 Prevention Resource Guide that's available on the Information Gateway. I encourage you to get that. It has a lot of in-depth information about the protective factors, much more than what I've described here. If you want additional information about protective capacities frameworks, again, as I mentioned, you can get that through the Action website or also on the Child Welfare Information Gateway website. And then I also want to mention the Friends National Center for Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention. Their website has tremendous information as well, in-depth information, of course, about the Protective Factors Survey. So if that's another source of information that you might want to look for. Okay, so we have a couple of questions we'd like you to respond to, or give you an opportunity to see if you have any questions about the frameworks or the common ground. And also just want to let you know you can actually scroll through the infographic on your own now on the screen. You should have the ability to move it up and down if you'd like to look at it as we do this. So I see some in the question about how you envision using the infographic in your work, provide it to my coworkers and prevention staff in my agency and community. Having trouble making this scroll slowly so I can read it. Okay, there we go. Provide it to my teammates as well as using it to help my families understand what I'm looking for. Incorporate in family assessments. Good reference in several of my advocacy support work. See where this overlaps with our current practice model and if there are areas we can enhance by including additional information. Good training document. Provide information to CBCAP Advisory Board. Apply in the field. Present to staff in continuous quality improvement meetings every 3 months. That's a great idea. Provide our prevention policy specialists to use in guidance. Also our training unit can incorporate it into their curriculum. We can use to develop safety plans and treatment plans, assisting workers with developing safety plans, go over with families at case plan meetings, reinforce the work we're currently doing as a refresher for tenured staff, and use as a basis to support staff training we currently do. Okay, I see a question that says, we are a state using the safety model, safety assessment, in addition to a risk assessment at the CPS level. Do you think that results in confusion for staff? I'm not sure if the question is about whether related to the infographic that results in confusion for staff, or just using safety and risk as concepts results in confusion for staff. I would just say in general, I mean, the purpose of a risk assessment is to have a broader understanding of those factors that contribute to the likelihood of maltreatment. That's the definition of risk. So it's not, I don't think it's necessarily doesn't have to cause confusion as long as staff understand what is the purpose of a risk assessment and how does it inform the work that they're doing, and they have some way of understanding what they do with that information once they understand what the risk factors are, and then that they understand that in a safety model they're looking for those particular factors that represent present or impending danger, so they can create safety plans. So they can work collaboratively also, as long as staff have a clear understanding of what to do with the information, how they're related, but not the same. And I think you can see from the protective factors framework that it's very much compatible with a risk approach, understanding factors at the individual and community level, and those factors at the child level too. So it covers all those different categories. But of course, the purpose is to have a positive framework for understanding. So it's a strength-based framework that really goes to the point of risk mitigation and building on the strengths of families. So I don't know if that answers the question or not. Okay, looks like that answered the question. Okay, if there's other questions that anybody has, feel free. Or other thoughts you have about using the infographic, we'd love to hear those too. I think we're going to move on to looking at what upcoming events. I just wanted to I'll just finish my piece of this since it looks like we have no more questions. Thanks again for the opportunity to do this. If any of you are in D.C. at the national conference coming up, come by the booth, our action exhibit. I'd love to see you and be happy to answer any more questions face-to-face.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Teresa. So just a couple of little points about some upcoming events and products that's coming from the Center for States. On August 24th, the State Liaisons Officers Hot Topics webinar, Part 2, we'll be hosting that. So if you haven't registered, please do if you're an SLO. And likewise, if you're a Family Preservation or PSSF manager, on the same day, there'll be the Hot Topics webinar for that group of folks as well too. And so if you look on your screen where it says web links, there are 2 clickable links where you can register for those 2 events. Also on August 29th through the 30th is the SLO and CJA grantee meeting. If any of you are a part of those, we'll be there and looking forward to seeing you there, as well as the NCANS conference, which follows the grantee meetings. Also, regarding the protective capacities and protective factors infographic, we will be emailing the infographic to all the registrants, as well as a link for the infographic. I know that question came up, I believe, in the Q&A. So we'll be sending that out to all of you at the end of this month. And then also with a copy of this recording. So you'll have all of that in one nice, neat email. And once the infographic is available for, the link is available, I'll also put it on the listserv, so you guys can pass that along too for other folks to have access to it. Also, just wanted to say that regarding CANTSD, if you have more interest in protective factors, they will have coming out addressing protective factors through the use of evidence-based programs, an introduction to practice guide, and that'll be coming out soon as well. And when it's available, we'll distribute it also on the listservs as well. So that's what's coming up for the Center for States for this area, and we definitely are hoping that you're able to join us. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and, I believe, close it out. Say thank you once again for joining us today in this webinar, and hope to see you soon. Thanks so much. Take care.